All right, we're going to talk about absolute value equations and inequalities. So I just want to remind you, if you had something like 2x plus 1 equals 5, that would be an equation because it has an equal sign. Something that where you replace the equal sign with something that looks like this, less than, greater than, less than or equal to, or greater than or equal to, those are called inequalities. And you've worked with them some in the past. One thing that might be new is interval notation. So this would mean inclusion, and this will make sense once we get started. And this is not included. The ones that are inclusive up here would be these. That means they're less than or equal to or greater than or equal to. So when you're talking about an inequality that looks like this, you'll use brackets. Ones where they're not included, you'll use parentheses. Another thing that we're going to use with interval notation is negative infinity. And positive infinity. And those will be important to know, especially when you're doing your college algebra class. You'll just start off day one using interval notation. So I want to remind you a little bit about how you would graph an inequality on a number line. So this is saying all the solutions that work for x are numbers that are greater or equal to the number 3. So when I graph this, and I'm just going to make you use the point 3. Since 3 works as a solution, I'm going to put a closed dot, so it's inclusive. And then all the numbers that work for x are bigger than 3. So they would be the numbers that go to the right. So if I'm going to write this with interval notation, what I put in the first spot of interval notation is my starting value. The first value that works is 3. And then everything that works after 3, so I'm going to say it goes in the direction of positive infinity. Now, because 3 works, I'm going to put a bracket. And then we really can't do inclusive on infinity, so anytime you have infinities, you will use parentheses. I think this is how you spell it. Parentheses. So let's do one where we're talking about numbers that are like t is less than -1. So all the values that work for t are going to be smaller than -1. So if I draw a number line, really all I'm concerned about is that you put -1 on there. This time -1 does not work because there's no line under there. So I'm going to have an open circle, and then all the numbers that are smaller than -1 will go this direction. Now what I want you to be careful about is in elementary, sometimes the teacher would say, you just shade whichever way the arrow goes. And that's not always the case, because sometimes if the variable is on the right side, it won't work that way. So what I do is I talk about how t is smaller than -1, so here's where the numbers are smaller. So then if I write this one in interval notation, I'm going to have negative infinity first, and then it's going to go up to -1. Infinities always have parentheses, and since this one's not included, it would also have a parenthesis. Let's talk about a compound inequality. So a compound inequality would be two inequalities put together using and or. So in this case, I'm going to say that x is greater than -1 and x is less than or equal to 3. So if I graph this on a number line, I'm going to need -1 and 3. -1 does not work. Its number is bigger than -1. It's not inclusive, so I'm going to put an open circle. X is smaller than or equal to 3, so since 3 works, I'm going to put a closed circle, and I'm going to shade all the things in between. So if we write this with interval notation, I'm going to start at -1 and go to 3. -1 doesn't work, so it's a parenthesis. 3 does work, so it's a bracket. This is an and statement. What about if I said x is less than or equal to -1 or x is greater than 3? This time it can't be both. It's either smaller than -1 or bigger than 3. So when I put that on my number line, I'm going to say -1, 3. It's smaller than or equal to -1, so it shades this direction, and bigger than 3, so it shades this direction. When I write this in interval notation, it's going to be written like this. The smallest value I have is -infinity, and it goes to -1. Parenthesis here and bracket here because that's inclusive. Now there's some numbers in between here that we skip. So we're going to use the symbol that means or. So it's these or. I'm going to start back up at 3 and go to infinity. This is actually called the union symbol. It's these numbers or these numbers. So this is going to be parenthesis and parenthesis. I do want to remind you that whenever you are solving an inequality, for instance, let's say I have -2x plus 7 is greater than 11. If I'm solving this inequality, I would start by subtracting 7 from both sides. And then I would divide both sides by -2. And a reminder, when you have an inequality and you divide by a negative number, it reverses the symbol. So in this case, x would be less than -2. All those numbers would make this work. So for instance, like if I pick -3, -2 times -3 is +6, plus 7 is, let's see here, +6 plus 7 is actually 13, and 13 is greater than 11, so those work.